Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fully Charged Show podcast, where today we're talking solar electric vehicles with Steve Fambro, the co-founder and co-CEO of Aptera Motors. Now, if you're not familiar with Aptera Motors, I highly recommend that you take this moment to press pause, go and Google Aptera Motors, and then come back. You will be totally blown away. The team are busy gearing up towards production, and that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. And honestly, what follows is a really honest, transparent, and incredibly candid account of what it's like to start an electric vehicle organisation. Totally fascinating. But before we get into our conversation with Steve, I need 30 seconds of your time. And to tell you that, first of all, my name is Imogen Bogle. I am one of the presenters and producers here on the Fully Charged Show and Everything Electric Show. I highly recommend that you also go and check out those YouTube channels after you've listened to this fabulous podcast. And secondly, I need to tell you about our live shows. Next up, we're in Vancouver at the start of September, and we would love it if you came and joined us for a festival of electrification. There will be thousands of electric vehicle test drives, loads of clean energy technologies to see and get to grips with. Our home energy advice zone will be there, so you can ask questions around your own property. There'll be loads of panel discussions to hear what's coming next in the world of clean energy and electric vehicles. And of course, we'll be there. And it is always such a treat to get to meet you, our lovely viewers and listeners. So do make sure to check out all of the important details in the description box below. But enough of that, let's talk solar electric vehicles. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. I had the absolute pleasure of coming out to San Diego 2 years ago to visit Aptera, and it was just totally extraordinary. And since then, I think we've featured Aptera twice on the channel already. Jack doing both those episodes, which I'm not jealous about whatsoever. And, you know, whenever we talk about Aptera, our audience go absolutely wild. And I see that sort of same sentiment, you know, echoing across all the content that you put out into the world. But for those who may not be familiar, can you tell us who is Aptera? What are you doing? What is your solar electric vehicle?
Who is Aptera? What are we doing? Aptera is a company that just has a simple vision, and that is we're building a future where every journey is powered by the sun, and that drives everything that we do. So, in order to make that happen, we had to develop technology in solar panel manufacturing and high voltage electronics. And we also had to make a very lightweight and efficient vehicle that could be a reduced energy consumption such that it could be powered by the sun. But that singular focus has really driven our product to look the way it does, which is a very sleek, aerodynamic, lightweight, two-passenger vehicle with lots of cargo room, by the way, about 1,000 liters of cargo space, which is not insignificant. So that's us in a nutshell. And what we're doing is we are bringing this first vehicle, the Aptera, into production. Every day we're getting a little bit closer, not only through crowdfunding, but through the other funding measures that we're doing. It's no secret it takes a lot of money to start a car company, but I would say not as much for us, just because our vehicle is built completely differently. We have less than 10 parts in our body structure, whereas a typical car has 200. And so that means there's a lot less tooling, there's less cost, there's less overhead, there's just less money needed. Still lots of money compared to other startups, but much less than a typical car. And so that's what we're doing. We're bringing the vehicle in production. We hope to be in production by very early next year. And we have, we're going through the phase now of the PI builds, which have started in Italy, and we have some of those units here. We're going to have the first driving soon. We've got all kinds of internal milestones for the development team. And we're seeing the company really shift from being a car design company to really a software company, because everything is running on software. You know, there's hundreds of solar cells, 15 computers, lots of code to write. And so it's a large part of our work at this point.
I mean, I really hope whoever is listening to this podcast that has gone to Google and frantically Googled Aptera and seen the absolutely extraordinary design of the vehicle. I can only describe it, and I think you've used this language yourself as an organization. It's fish-like. It's got a drag coefficient of 0.15, which is just totally unheard of. It's got 700 watts of solar panels on the roof, which can provide 40 miles of solar powered driving a day. The design has been AI generated, or certainly kind of using AI tools in order to get to the most lightweight and efficient structure. It is an engineer's car, I would say. And it really feels to me like it's the product of what happens if you boot designers out of the room. And that's not to say that it doesn't look beautiful, because it does look beautiful. But it is a car whose motivation has been driven solely, it feels, by efficiency. Is that fair to say? Was that the intention at the beginning?
It's absolutely fair to say, and you're positively correct. But I wouldn't go so far as to say we booted design out of the room. Jason Hill is still a very good part of the organization. But it did start from that perspective. I am an engineer myself, electrical engineer, and when I when I set about before I started Aptera, I wanted to convert a car to electric, which was the only way to get electric cars back in the early 2000s, and nobody made them. Well, maybe a handful of people did, but nothing you could drive on the highway. And I quickly discovered that these conversions, they didn't go very far. They went 20, 40 miles, some maybe more. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Lead acid batteries was one, but I also discovered that most of these vehicles were using half their energy just to push the air out of the way, and it felt like, and because of styling, really, just because of the way the vehicle looked, and it felt like such an absurd admission. I mean, even if it weren't battery, just thinking of gasoline, right? Gasoline is so expensive to the environment in terms of we have to pump it, we have to defend the oil's free flow, the environmental costs. It's very expensive. So why would we waste half of our energy, whether it's gas, hydrogen, electric? Why would we waste half of it just because of some random styling cue? It felt absurd to me, as an engineer, offensive even. And so I did what most engineers ask. I took one term of the equation, said, well, let me look at 1/2 CDA rho v square, and say, well, what can I change? Well, I can't really change rho. That's the density of air. I can change a little bit if I go up to Denver, but it's not that much. I can't really change the area because two people sitting side by side are gonna take up a certain amount of space. Velocity, can't change that because you're driving at highway speed. So really, the only thing I could change was a drag coefficient. And then I asked sort of a rhetorical question to get me thinking, which is something my boss would have us do. Set a term and set a term to zero or infinity, and see what happens to the equation. And so I just asked this rhetorical question: well, what happens if we set the drag equal to zero? What does that shape look like? Surely it must be mathematically describable. It may be impractical, but let's at least find it. And that set me down the path, which would later become Aptera.
That's so interesting. And I should disclose at this point in time that I am a former aerodynamics engineer, although I was not a brilliant one. I think I was far more interested about talking about engineering than doing the engineering. But that's a really, really interesting, I guess, thought exercise. And that typically, you start with, well, what does that vehicle need? What does the package of that vehicle need to hold? It's the crash structure. It's all of the various ADAS features. It's 2 occupants, 3,000 dogs, 4 children, etc., etc. And actually, then you're trying to retrofit these aerodynamic features to try and squish the ceiling a little bit, or the roof a little bit, get it lower to the ground, make it more curvy. But actually, if you start with the reverse of that problem and say, what is perfection? What is the perfect aerodynamic shape? And then work backwards from that to make it work for a vehicle, then it's a totally different approach. And that's what results in that teardrop shape, that sort of fish teardrop, very efficient structure that you have with the Aptera. But you mentioned there that you began this journey in the early 2000s. And I want to touch on that because Aptera has a phenomenal following, and I also want to ask you about that because that in itself is absolutely extraordinary. But you started in 2006, you stopped in 2010, there's a bit of a hiatus, and then re-kicked things off in 2019. Obviously, it hasn't been a straightforward journey, and I imagine timing and appetite for electric vehicles has been a huge contributing factor to that. But I'm also astounded that you've remained motivated to keep pushing this and to keep saying, this is worthwhile. I really, really believe in this mission of creating solar electric vehicles. Can you give us a whistle-stop tour of your Aptera journey?
A whistle-stop tour. Sure. Um, so I started in earnest. I was working at Illumina, a biotech company here in San Diego, and it is a great company, and it was a great job. And I was challenged every day, similar to how you were challenged at university. It really made you think. It pushed you out of your comfort zone, and we got to a point where we had, with my department, with the things we were working on, we had really taken the technology as far as it could go. And so the work that was remaining just wasn't that interesting to me. It paid very well, and I would have financially been well advised to stay there and continue to keep my stock instead of selling it. But I wanted the challenge. And it's a time in my life, I was married, but before children. And so I still, you think about life differently before you have children. And I had that free time to contemplate and give. And so I started exploring this idea, and it was around 2005. I said I want to make it a business, and wrote a business plan with a good friend, help of a good friend of mine. Never written one before because I wasn't an entrepreneur, hadn't raised money, but I knew a lot of people that had, which invariably you will find them around a biotech company. And it really, once we got funded, Chris and I got funded. I would say it was the dominant factor in my life up until I left in 2009. And Chris and I both left at the same time. We were asked to leave, or shown the door rather, after a nasty, internal fight. But that we just, it wasn't a good fit for us anymore, and the company needed or wanted to go a different direction with the board, and so we left to go do something different. Chris started a battery company, took it public, and I got into vertical farming because I love food, and that kept me busy for many years. Took me overseas to Abu Dhabi. I worked for, um, you might say, an important family over there, and ran an ag tech fund. And when I came back to the United States in 2017, Chris and I and Jason met after a year or so, and said, I hadn't really thought about electric vehicles since. I mean, I bought one, I was driving one, but I thought, no one would ever want to go up against Tesla. Why would you? It's one of the most popular, it is the most popular EV in the world. And it was really when we started looking at the advancements in solar and battery tech, and we realized, wait a minute, this new technology in our old platform would, it would really be fantastic. Like it would have the smallest battery pack, it would go the furthest range. There's something there. Let's explore that. And that really became the rebirth of the company. It had never really left us. It was more of like suppressing a painful memory. It's not like we said, well, we don't care about electric vehicles or the space. We poured our heart and soul into the company. I mean, I started it in my garage, and it was a very acrimonious end for us, and so it was um, painful to think about, and therefore easy to block out and ignore how men often do, rather than attending to the thing. So it never really went away for both of us, and when we decided to get the band back together again, I think we'd said, well, look at all the experience we have now, all the mistakes that we've made and learned from in business, and I think we'd be much better at it this time. We have a very long list of things we wouldn't do or would do, whereas that list was not even formed when we first started the company.
It's really extraordinary, because actually I imagine that takes a vast amount of humility to take a situation that's actually quite painful, not least because we see it a lot of times with founders of organizations. That company is your baby. You have so much energy, time, attention that's gone into its development, and then for it to not go exactly in the direction that you hoped it would, and then to come back, that's I guess a huge amount of humility. But at the same time, what's so interesting is that when you look at the cost of solar panels the cost of batteries in 2006 versus then what they are in 2019 and now what they are in 2024, it's almost as if, you had the idea too soon and it needed that kind of incubation period such that 2019 was precisely the right time to say, this is it, this is the moment. But you mentioned that, okay, there's no point going up against Tesla, or certainly not in kind of, for Aptera necessarily. But you've got 50,000 or almost 50,000 pre-orders. I suspect a lot of those people are Tesla drivers. So who do you think, or how would you describe the kind of average Aptera pre-order person? What kind of people are they?
Well, according to Sarah, who recently left, but to her credit, she built an incredible team. She built the following along with Chris, and just done an amazing amount of work for the company. Her and her team had performed this analysis of the sort of the archetype discovery of a lot of our reservation holders, and they really fall into two camps. They are the I would say the early adopter tech savvy types, and the other camp, which is slightly less than half, is the environmentally conscious, um, aware. They want to make the right decisions. Two totally different segments of people, different demographics, psychographics, everything couldn't be more different. But they're both an essential part of our company and our brand in terms of who we have to appeal to. But I would say primarily it is dominated by tech people who want the best, whether they're looking to buy a sports car that's the fastest, or they're looking to buy a watch that's or a vehicle that's the most efficient, that goes that's powered by the sun, that kind of thing. They're looking for something really unique that no one else has. There's always a segment of people who are doing that, and so I think that's about more than 50% of our customers.
I think what's interesting about that is that you've got on the one hand these very tech savvy people, as you describe, who are the early adopters and who are always going to have the latest and greatest technology, who probably had some of the early Teslas. But at the same time, this is a vehicle that's 30 something $1,000. It's 400-mile range on a 35 kilowatt hour battery. It's still deeply, deeply practical. And actually what that's really saying is efficiency is cool, excess maybe less so. And it's quite cool to see that happen and to see how that might have a trickle down effect, that actually it totally normalizes having quite an obscure looking vehicle, and kind of reprioritizing efficiency over huge volumes of space or what have you. I mean, how does that relate to kind of the long term mission and vision of Aptera? Is it sort of a case of, this is going to be cool technology, or is this a case of actually how can this enable greater access to affordable, clean mobility?
I think you answered that actually perfectly. It was a great observation. I think the customers around the world have already selected for efficiency. And I certainly don't want to come on your show and talk about another brand, but I do have to be humble and give respect where it's due. And I think when you look at the marketplace at the moment, we have a very fantastic vehicle. It's not on the roads in terms of people are buying it yet. It's only prototypes. But if you look at what's being sold now, what has been being sold, um, the Tesla products, the ones that are the most efficient, are really the ones that dominate the sales. And it's range per dollar of purchase price really is the way I look at the data. And if you look at the sales data on that metric, I think you'll see that the customers are essentially selecting for efficiency by buying the longest range, best value price product. Sure, there's always some who are going to buy the more luxurious or the larger or fastest or that kind of thing. But I think by and large, people want to go the furthest range possible for the least amount of money, and that's what is reflected in the marketplace. That's what's reflected in the sales data. And so long term, I think the same trend. I don't see any reason why the trend would change, and that's less about the physics of battery um, design. Even if a battery could take a 10C charge sustainably and without any damage, we would need 10 or 12 megawatt plant at every so-called fueling station or charging station to provide that level of charge. And that's just not going to happen. And so we looked ahead and just, we're all engineers and physicists here. And as we think about the constraints, the levers that we can pull and change and the ones that we can't, I think for the foreseeable future, people are going to be choosing the longest range vehicles possible because no kind of charger at the moment or on the horizon is going to be able to fuel vehicles as fast as, let's say, a gasoline station can with a gasoline car. With gasoline, you're fueling 36 kilowatt hours of gas in about 10 seconds. And so, to do that in Aptera, you would need almost 2,300 amps of charging, to get the same kind of rate. So even if the battery and the equipment would do it, there's just no pathway on the horizon to deliver that much power to so many people so quickly. So really, the alternative is to make the vehicle efficient and able to go a very long distance without needing to be charged. That's how we see us winning that battle.
Earlier, you said that you found sort of the lack of efficiency offensive from an engineering perspective. I think that's such a perfect way to put it, because actually, what you're describing is that we're in a period of time where we need to create energy in the most efficient way possible, and we need to use that energy to do the thing we need to do in the most efficient way possible. And anything else is just like the equivalent of, skipping down the road and just throwing money here, there, and everywhere. And actually, I suppose what this forces us to do is to have a much more tangible relationship with energy and how we quantify what efficiency means, what range means, what right sizing means, and how that relates to, how we use these vehicles as well. It's I think it's an interesting philosophical engineering question, perhaps.
If I just want to follow that thought or finish that thought rather, by focusing on making the average North American driver's daily travel powered by the sun, let's say some less than 40 miles a day, I think is what on average they drive. You take the whole scale and charging infrastructure out of the discussion, with the exception of road trips. And then it just becomes something very different. I had to drive to Las Vegas twice in the past month on business, and once with my son. And we stopped and made two charges, on the way out there. And because it was a road trip, we needed to go out and stretch our legs, use the bathroom, get something to drink. Anyway, it was just fine. So if that's already acceptable, and it's evidenced by the number of electric vehicles in those massive charging stations, in Barstow and Baker. So if you're talking about then just the daily need, we don't need to recreate the energy infrastructure like recreating gasoline stations in terms of delivering, that much power at that kind of rate for everybody, because the sun is your filling station for most people with Aptera. And there's nothing that has to be installed like from a grid perspective.
I recently had to moderate a panel discussion, and it was about sort of, charting the path to 2050 and all that sort of stuff. And, it was quite a serious discussion. And then the final question was, if we have one thing that we can do to make this transition that much easier, to accelerate that transition, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the panelists, he gave such a fantastic answer. He was like, I think we need to take wonder in the world around us and to marvel at the technology that we've created. And I think that sort of sense that you can go 40 miles powered by the sun, if someone told you that, I don't know, 60 or 70 years ago, you would, even 10 years ago, you just wouldn't believe them. It is absolutely extraordinary that we have the technology that's flat, that's lightweight, that can do that. It's, it's starting to make any kind of magic in Harry Potter not that impressive, because we have it in the form of really efficient technologies. You mentioned earlier that starting an automotive business is hard. I'd say it's almost masochistic. It's extremely, extremely, extremely hard. And actually, we've seen a number of other solar-powered EV companies, or solar EV companies, I should say, and EV startups generally fail because it is really difficult. I think Lightyear and Sonotime probably being, the most notable casualties on that regard. What are the biggest challenges? What are the things that give you moments of concern in this, charting the pathway to scaling up for production next year?
I would say for Aptera, the biggest I wouldn't say a concern or preoccupation. Our preoccupation right now is raising the last bit of money that we need to get in production.
Mhm.
Um, and if you look at any startup vehicle company, they've always needed more money than they thought they did. And I would say they've also, many of them, and I'm speaking with the benefit of hindsight, have um, hired, and we've made decisions sometimes as well. Maybe we've hired or too quickly, or maybe got into a building too quickly that we didn't need yet. And so I think the temptation, well, the challenge is managing that growth, trying to pace it with your ability to fundraise and not outstrip it, so that you're not put in a bad place. And we've survived for so long because we've got a very good finance team who make sure that we spend every dollar wisely, and we have to account for everything. Even if I buy, I mean, I don't like if I buy pencils or something like that, I buy it on my own. I don't expense it. But if I buy something for the company, if um, and it's something related to an investor visit or something like that, I have to turn in my receipt like everybody else. And if it needs to get questioned, it gets questioned. And so we have, I would say we can always do better. Every company can always do better. And we should endeavor to always, spend less, like be on some trajectory of like OpEx per head count or per revenue. That's just not a flat line, but it's always going down. But I think is this preoccupation with money, spending it very carefully, and has been part of our success. I hope it's a continued part of our success. It's not easy because as you've seen, like the program hasn't moved along as fast as we wanted it to. But we're also not going to spend in a way that puts us in a
Mhm.
difficult position. So we has to be timed. Everything has to be timed very carefully, but as
Mhm.
fast as it can possibly go.
And you do see that. I mean, so many organizations who probably raised money during the pandemic is almost like, if you imagine you're on the treadmill and you turn up the speed and you're suddenly like, oh my God, I can't keep up with this speed. And that's when you sort of spin off. And actually, that sort of constantly taking stock of we need to be steady seems so crucially important. And I feel one of the things that as an observer to your organization is that you have a tremendous amount of transparency with, the public, but also the people, your investors who have invested via
Mhm.
crowdfunding. And I suppose that transparency has really held you to account that you are spending their money super, super wisely. Has that transparency been a really intentional part of your approach?
It has once we realize the importance of it. I'm not going to misrepresent and say we set out from the very beginning to be as transparent as
Mm.
possible. There have been certain voices, within inside the company. And Sarah, one of them, always encouraging us to really like this is what our fans want to see. They want this transparency, and it's good for us in all these different ways. And so it has become part of our culture. And again, it's something we can always improve upon. We can always do better than what we're doing right now. But I don't want to take credit to say it's something that Chris and I just said from the
Mm.
beginning. We'd have to give really credit to other people that raised it to our attention that, hey, this is really important not only for the organization but for the brand as well. And we just
Mm.
made it a part of who we are.
So it seems sort of a big area of focus for you over the next 12 to 18 months as you go up to sort of full scale production. And I should say, actually, quick question. What will your annual production capacity look like when you're up at full scale?
Well, per per factory, we have a design. It's the one that Monroe and Associates has helped us design, and it's first embodied here in this building. But this this setup, if you will, is rated for about 10,000 vehicles per year per shift. So two shifts per day, 20,000 vehicles a year. And we can certainly expand the building and do more per building, but we were it, it wasn't clear to us, and it still isn't clear to us at the moment where that higher volume should occur centrally, if it occurs centrally at all. It might need to be even further distributed such that there's, a small plant on the East Coast and one on the West Coast, especially if our assemblies arrive, as we intend them to. We're really, by the time you get to vehicle assembly, you're just bolting things together. We're not welding, we're not painting, we're not doing anything like that. So it changes the idea of what the car plant even needs to look like or what it needs to be to function. There are some advantages to being co-located with some of the processes, but not all of them. It's composites would be um, the biggest benefit to have. It's to be co-located with that, right? Because you have individual pieces that you want to not really inventory and move around. You just want to assemble into the body, and then once you have that, then everything else can just be bolted onto it. So I would say long term, having the composites facility close to production is very important. We're doing that initially in Italy, where we'll make the bodies there, right at CPC, and then we have to look and say, well, where does it make sense to do that? In North America or in other places in the world, like in United Arab Emirates or somewhere in the United States, perhaps.
I mean, of course, Sandy Munro and Munro and Associates have been involved in some capacity. He is obviously a true celebrity in the engineering world. That's so interesting, isn't it? Because, whenever I have conversations with friends who sit outside of the automotive industry and outside of the engineering industry, and they're like, why does it take so many people to make a car? And I have never really given a suitable answer. It's like, oh, well, there's lots and lots of different components and there's lots of different bits that need to be considered. Such a rubbish answer. But I think what you've just said there, you're thinking about how do you take this prototype that has been produced at reasonably small scales. It is such a different type of vehicle. It's much more simple to produce, but it uses loads of different types of technologies, and actually having to ask yourself questions around, well, does it make sense to have some of that on site? What makes sense to have that outsourced? What should suppliers do versus what should be sort of reasonably vertically integrated within the organization? Even that alone is like a hugely, hugely complex task. And I suppose actually, not to say that making a prototype is easy, it isn't at all. But I suppose this is really kind of crunch time, understanding how that supply chain needs to come together. And not least when obviously 20,000 is a large number, but it's certainly not hundreds of thousands where perhaps that supply chain benefits from economy of scale. Yeah, I guess, I don't know, I it's one of those things where my mind starts going, I'm like, oh, I'm stressed on your behalf. But how... Oh,
Well, I was
sorry.
just going to say, a lot of conventional automotive assembly plants, they're only profitable if they're running above 90 or 95% capacity. It doesn't make sense, any financial sense, for them to operate at 80 or half capacity because there's so much inertia of things that have to happen to even make one vehicle flow down the assembly line. And in order to cover that cost, it really needs to be operating and to recover the amortization of the tooling cost in a couple of years, et cetera. And so it's by design that those plants have to operate at that level just to be efficient. And it's by consequence of us that we don't have to operate at that speed. And it's just by consequence of, I would say, primarily centered around the composite body design having only 10 pieces. That it just changes the largest single tooling costs of the vehicle, which is traditionally is the body and the structure, and it reduces that by an order of magnitude. And so then that gives us the flexibility that a lot of other manufacturers don't have. And on the other items, because we're vertically integrated, we own the battery design, we own our suspension design, where it's these things are made for us, to our spec, or they're made in house. The same with the solar. We decide how we want to ramp and scale that up. We don't have to have 20 or 100,000 unit a year agreement that we must, commit to in order to just have the item. So we have that luxury that a lot of other larger manufacturers don't, just because of how our vehicles are architected.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess it sort of emphasized the point that there is a reason it's so difficult for large OEMs to transition to electric vehicles, to change over their plants, because they're having to do huge investments in tooling. They need those guarantees of sales such that they can get, the payback on all of that tooling. But also it shows why it is generally more appealing for those organizations to create large SUVs, because they have higher profit margins. They can recoup that value much quicker than smaller, cheaper things. And that's why it's so critically important that we need organizations like yourself to really drive forward the desire and the need for low cost, efficient electric vehicles. Okay, so when you see the Aptera vehicle, they seem like they totally make sense in California. They look absolutely at home there and totally perfect. Here in the UK, we've had quite a horrible spell of just a lot of rain. Will the solar panels and will all of that kind of thing still work in a European market? And is there any intention to bring the vehicle to Europe?
Yes, there is intention to bring it to Europe. The the details of homologation are still, I would say, being finalized and under review. It has to do with the vehicle size, weight and width, and the levers that we can pull and the levers that we can't. And if you've ever, I haven't been to London or England rather than just passing through the airport, so I don't. I don't know what that's like. I've seen pictures, but I've lived in Europe for a while, and I've traveled, of course, extensively to Italy, and more often now going to Rome because of the work that we're doing with the Italian government. And the kind of vehicle we need for Rome it's like incredibly different than what you need to drive in other places in Europe. Even it's just, I'd say the mission is just different. And I imagine in England, it's very similar, right? You have, when I see from the videos, I watch a lot of in the countries, one lane roads and, of course, the overcast often and not as much insulation. So I think on the power side, are you going to get 40 miles a day every day like you would in San Diego? No, it's going to be less. And I think our website lets you calculate how much that is from the NREL data itself. So it's not our estimation; it's NREL data collected by the government. But even in overcast, there is some light coming through and able to create some power. So, it could be 10 to 18 miles a day, let's say, in those kind of conditions, and that still might be meaningful for a lot of people. But is the form of the vehicle, the best for narrow streets and tiny parking spots and what have you? And I don't know. I think we'd have to go and drive and see what that's like. But does that mean that there's the next model of Aptera that's already being ideated with that in mind, at least, so that we can begin thinking about it and planning on it? I mean, that certainly could happen. I don't want to say that it's happening or not because we're laser focused on getting this vehicle in production. But it is something that people are aware of.
Well, our audience will be extremely thrilled to hear that it might be something that might well be being ideated, but no confirmation at this point. But if you do need some guinea pigs in the UK, then I am more than willing to see how it fares on a very narrow road in Oxford. I have to tell you this because I'm not proud of this. One of my friends at the weekend was saying, because you work in cars and with the Fully Charged show, are you a better driver? And I thought, no, absolutely not. And there have been various instances on our Victorian Terrace Road where there's cars on either side, there's extremely limited parking, and there's been a car coming the other way, and I have got out of the car and said, look, I'm really sorry, you're going to have to be the one that reverses here. I'm not trying to be difficult, but I might cry if you ask me to reverse instead. But anyway.
It's a different environment. I mean, it's something that we're not used to here. And we have our own problems, here. We're not worried about being on a one-lane road, but we might be worried about getting shot, in a road rage incident or something. So everyone has their own driving difficulties. But it can be very stressful when you're in that situation. I understand completely. I've been there myself.
Oh, I'm not proud of it, but it happens more frequently than I care to admit. But, and I think personally, that's why I love mobility generally as a kind of a topic, because it is so personal and it is so different depending on geography. And even if people think that they're not car people and they don't care anything about cars, they do care about being able to get to the things that they need to get to, and to do so in an affordable and easy way. And thinking of all those very, very human factors of how you design something, how you create something that can serve someone's daily drive with 40 miles totally being powered by the sun, I think is just the coolest challenge in the whole world. We are coming towards the end, but I want to ask you, you've been on this journey since the early 2000s, a totally extraordinary journey where you have built an organization at a time when people weren't really talking about electric vehicles. This totally wasn't a thing. Solar panels were still very expensive and not that widely deployed in the way that they are today. Electric vehicles certainly weren't at the volumes that they were at. You stepped away for a time, you came back, the technology has transformed and made this way more ready. Unbelievable journey. And then, throw on top of that, there's a huge cult following surrounding Aptera. Our audience very much in that cult included. But what advice would you give to yourself starting out on this journey? Would you still start out on this journey knowing everything that you know now?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely would. I would say the advice I would give myself or anybody, it would be to learn to make decisions quicker and try and make high quality decisions quicker, especially about people or technology or strategies. Um, and also you remind myself, as a leader, that's one job, but being a leader does not necessarily mean you're out to be everyone's friend, and that's different. And you have to think about that very carefully because it's not like the military. It's a private organization and people can choose to come and go. And so it's a very, I would say, a nuanced form of leadership that's required, especially in organizations where people can be quickly drawn away to other companies, maybe with higher pay, or I can't say more interesting work because I don't know if there's more interesting work out there. Um, but I would have apprised myself just more so of uh, leadership styles and techniques that are appropriate for a tech company, make decisions quicker, and um, and just make the decision. I think that's the most important thing. You'll get it right 70% of the time. Just make the
Mm.
decision.
So interesting because, and I have this discussion with many people that we speak to on the show, that oftentimes the technology's there. The capability to develop that technology is there. And so often the challenges arise through deeply human challenges, leadership styles, or dynamics within a team, or how something is communicated outside of the organization. And I think it's a really interesting thing to observe as someone who does have this kind of, we drop in, we speak to various organizations, and we definitely do observe that culture and sort of the ones that seem to have a greater recipe for success and those that maybe a little bit more challenging. Okay, I'm going to ask you one last question. So gearing up to production next year, 2025, how will you celebrate? What will
Well,
the feeling be?
it's hard to say. Chris and I are not. We're not one to celebrate necessarily, only because it's. We don't want to delude ourselves into thinking that there's no more work to do. But I would say if I do any kind of celebration, it'll be to take my family somewhere on a mini break, as you might say, or a vacation, and completely disconnect the phone and computer, which I've never done in the past, as long as they can remember, and just enjoy some time with them in a way that's not interrupted by Aptera, which dominates all of our lives. So I think
Mm.
that's how I'd celebrate.
It is the your other child, I suppose.
Yes, it's a bit like having a golden doodle, which is like a perpetual 2-year-old toddler. They'll never evolve from that state. They just always require the attention and touch and love and affirmation and that kind of thing. And I think any company is that way.
Yeah. I have to ask you, because you do have a dog in the background. Is your dog a golden doodle?
Yes, it's he's a, what do you call it? Australian Labradoodle, maybe.
Oh my goodness me.
Biscuit, come over here.
Oh, what perfection. I
Biscuit.
mean, but I think that also says something about your personality that, if you've got a golden doodle organization and a golden doodle at home that's a perpetual 2-year-old and requires that constant attention and hard work, then that clearly says something of you as an individual and your grit and resilience and joy, I suppose.
I'm very stubborn, so I don't quit easily.
Well, honestly, thank you so much. Our presenter Ricky will be out in August, I think, filming an episode with you guys, and I absolutely can't wait to see what he comes back with. So thank you so much for your time,
My
and
pleasure.
speak again soon.
Take care.
That is all that we have time for today. Thank you so much to Steve for taking the time to join us and to share the Aptera journey. It is so fascinating. Thank you so much to Katie, who will be editing this particular episode, and thank you to you for joining us. Before you go, if I could ask one teeny tiny favour, if you could like, comment or subscribe to this episode, we would so appreciate it. It really helps to ensure that we can keep on sharing the important and cool stuff in this clean energy transition. So that's it. If you have been, thank you for listening.